Have you ever wondered why some people seem to attract everyone they meet? They don't have the loudest voice. They're not the richest person in the room. They aren't always the funniest, and they certainly aren't perfect. Yet somehow, people trust them. People remember them. People feel comfortable around them. It's almost as though they carry something invisible, something that draws others in without even trying. For most of my life, I wondered about that mystery too. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was born in the year 1924. If the good Lord has been kind enough to let me see another sunrise, then I have now lived for 102 years. I've watched horses disappear from city streets. I've watched telephones become tiny computers that fit inside our pockets. I've watched the world move faster and faster. Yet one thing has never changed: the human heart. No matter how much technology changes, people still want the very same things they wanted 100 years ago: to be understood, to be appreciated, to be loved, and perhaps most of all, to feel like they matter. You see, I've met thousands of people throughout my lifetime. Children with impossible dreams, young couples deeply in love, busy businessmen chasing success, mothers sacrificing everything for their families, soldiers returning home, teachers changing lives, doctors saving them, and ordinary people living extraordinary stories that no one else ever noticed. After watching people for more than a century, I came to realize something. The happiest people weren't always the wealthiest. The most loved people weren't always the most beautiful. The most unforgettable people weren't always the smartest. What made them special wasn't what they owned. It wasn't their appearance. It wasn't even their talent. It was how they made other people feel. That is the greatest gift any human being can ever possess. Many years ago, when I was just a young woman, I believed that attracting people meant saying clever things. I thought confidence meant talking more than everyone else. I believed people admired those who impressed them. Oh, how wrong I was. Life has a wonderful way of teaching us lessons we never expected. Sometimes gently, sometimes painfully. Mine came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. It was sometime in the early 1950s. Every morning before work, I would stop by the same little bakery. It wasn't a fancy place. The walls were plain. The shelves were wooden. The smell of fresh bread filled the air before sunrise. Most mornings were exactly the same. The customers nodded politely. The workers smiled. Someone would say, "Good morning." Someone else would answer, "Morning." That was the entire conversation, day after day, week after week, until one morning, everything changed. A young baker I'd never seen before looked up from behind the counter. Instead of saying, "Good morning," he smiled warmly, looked directly into my eyes, and quietly said, "I'm glad you came today." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Those weren't extraordinary words. There wasn't anything magical about them. Yet somehow, they reached a place inside my heart that ordinary greetings never had. As I walked home carrying my loaf of bread, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Why had those simple words affected me so deeply? The answer didn't come immediately. Sometimes wisdom arrives slowly, like the sunrise. Over the years, I finally understood. He hadn't greeted me. He had appreciated me. There is an enormous difference. Most greetings are automatic. They're spoken because society expects them. But appreciation, that comes from the heart. Think about your own life for just a moment. How many times has someone asked, "How are you?" And before you even had time to think, you answered, "I'm fine," even if you weren't. Perhaps you were exhausted. Perhaps your heart was aching. Perhaps you had just received terrible news. Perhaps you felt completely alone. Yet the words still came, "I'm fine." Not because they were true, but because that's what people expect. We've become so accustomed to these little conversations that we no longer hear them. They've become background noise, words without meaning, questions without curiosity, answers without honesty. And then we wonder why genuine connection feels so rare. Years later, when I became a volunteer at a local community center, I decided to try something different. Instead of asking people how they were, I welcomed them. Sometimes I'd simply smile and say, "I'm so happy you're here today." Other times I would say, "You've made this place brighter just by walking in. Do you know what happened?" People smiled differently. Not the polite smile we wear for strangers, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. Some laughed. Some looked surprised. A few even became emotional. One elderly gentleman held my hand and whispered, "No one has ever said that to me before." Imagine that, a man in his 70s, who had lived an entire lifetime without hearing someone tell him they were genuinely happy he had arrived. That day, I realized something I have never forgotten. Every person you meet is carrying something you cannot see. Some carry loneliness. Some carry fear. Some carry grief. Some carry disappointment. Others carry dreams they're afraid to share. And many carry invisible wounds, hidden behind ordinary smiles. You may never know what another person is facing, which is exactly why your words matter, more than you realize, because one sentence, spoken with sincerity, can become the brightest moment in someone's entire day, perhaps even their entire week, and sometimes their entire life. That is why I no longer believe that attracting people has anything to do with charm or cleverness or popularity. Real attraction begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment another human being feels safe in your presence, safe enough to smile, safe enough to speak honestly, safe enough to simply be themselves. And that feeling cannot be bought, cannot be forced, and cannot be faked. It must come from a heart that truly sees others. The 5 words I'm about to share change the way I speak to everyone I meet. Children, neighbors, friends, family, even complete strangers. Simple words. Only 5 of them, yet they carry a power far greater than most people ever imagine. And once you begin using them sincerely, you'll notice something remarkable starting to happen. People won't just hear your words. They'll remember how you made them feel. And that, my dear friend, is where every meaningful relationship truly begins. Now, you may be wondering, what are these 5 words after all this time? After all these stories? What could possibly be so powerful? Here they are. I'm glad you're here today. That's it. Just 5 simple words. Nothing complicated, nothing clever, nothing that requires years of practice. And yet, I've seen these 5 words change entire conversations before they even begin. The first time you say them sincerely, you'll notice something remarkable. People pause, not because they're confused, but because they're surprised. You see, most people are used to being acknowledged. Very few are used to being appreciated. There's a world of difference between someone noticing your presence and someone celebrating it. When you say, I'm glad you're here today. You're telling another person something their heart quietly longs to hear. You matter. Your presence has value. The world is a little brighter because you're in this moment with me. Every human being, whether they're 8 years old or 80 years old, wants to feel that. We spend our lives chasing success, recognition, money, status. But underneath all of those desires, there's a much simpler one: to know that our existence means something to someone else. I learned this lesson many years ago while visiting a small nursing home. There was a woman there named Margaret. She rarely spoke. Most days she simply stared out the window. Visitors came and went. Doctors checked on her. Nurses cared for her. Everyone was kind, but everyone was busy. One afternoon, I walked into her room. Instead of asking, "How are you today?" I smiled, sat beside her, and quietly said, "Margaret, I'm so glad you're here today." For a few moments, she didn't respond. She simply looked at me. Then tears slowly filled her eyes. She reached for my hand and whispered something I'll never forget. I thought everyone had forgotten me. Those words broke my heart, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from feeling invisible. There are people all around us, walking through grocery stores, standing in elevators, sitting in offices, eating in restaurants, who haven't felt truly noticed in weeks, maybe months, perhaps even years. We assume everyone is doing fine because they smile. But smiles can hide exhaustion. They can hide anxiety. They can hide heartbreak. One kind sentence can remind someone that they still matter. That realization changed my life forever. After that day, I began paying closer attention, not to what people said, but to what they needed. A young cashier working late into the evening, a tired mother trying to calm her little boy, an elderly man eating lunch alone, a nervous student waiting for an interview. Each one carried a different story, but every single one responded to kindness in exactly the same way. Their shoulders relaxed. Their smile became genuine. Their eyes softened. It's amazing what happens when another human being feels welcomed instead of merely acknowledged. People often ask me, "Eleanor, are those really the best words?" And I always smile, because the words themselves aren't magic. The feeling behind them is, if you say, "I'm glad you're here today," only because you're hoping someone will like you, people will sense it. The heart has a remarkable way of recognizing sincerity. True kindness never asks, "What can I get from this person?" Instead, it asks, "How can I make this person's day a little brighter?" That small difference changes everything. There was once a school teacher who invited me to speak to her students. She asked if I could share one lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. I walked into that classroom, looked around at dozens of young faces, some excited, some shy, some pretending not to care. Before saying anything else, I smiled and said, "I'm so glad every one of you is here today." The room became completely quiet. Later, one little girl stayed behind. She walked up to me and said, "My parents are getting divorced." I didn't know what to say. Then she continued, "I've had a really bad week." She smiled. "But when you said you were glad I was here, it made me feel important." Children remember kindness. Adults remember kindness. Even those who pretend they don't care remember kindness. That's because appreciation reaches places that compliments never can. Think about compliments for a moment. You're beautiful. You're smart. You're talented. Those are lovely things to hear, but they describe what someone has. Appreciation speaks to who someone is. It says, you don't have to impress me. You don't have to prove yourself. I'm simply grateful you're here. Can you see the difference? One creates pressure, the other creates peace. And peace is becoming one of the rarest gifts in today's world. We live in a time where everyone is trying to stand out. Everyone wants attention. Everyone wants to be heard. But very few people make others feel heard. That's why genuine appreciation has become so powerful. It's unexpected. It's refreshing. It's unforgettable. Of course, these 5 words aren't meant to replace every greeting. Sometimes you'll still say, good morning, or hello. There's nothing wrong with that. But whenever you have the opportunity, whenever your heart genuinely feels grateful for someone's presence, tell them. Don't keep appreciation trapped inside your thoughts. Speak it. You never know who desperately needs to hear it. Perhaps it's your husband after a long day at work. Perhaps it's your wife who quietly carries the weight of the family. Perhaps it's your child who wonders if anyone notices how hard they're trying. Perhaps it's your friend who's silently fighting depression. Perhaps it's the stranger serving your coffee. 5 words, only 5. Yet they have the power to remind another soul that they are seen. And when people feel seen, something beautiful begins to happen. Their guard comes down, their heart opens, and genuine connection quietly takes its place. But there is another reason these words are so powerful, one that has nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with how the human mind is naturally wired. Once I discovered that secret, everything finally made perfect sense. Let me share that with you next. There is something fascinating about the human mind. For more than 100 years, I've watched people search for the secret to being liked. Some believed it was confidence. Others believed it was beauty. Some chased wealth. Others chased popularity. But over the years, I noticed something they all overlooked. People are not drawn to perfection. They're drawn to how they feel when they're with you. That's a very different thing. Think back to your own life. Have you ever met someone who wasn't especially handsome or especially beautiful, yet everyone seemed to enjoy being around them? Of course you have. And have you ever met someone who seemed to have everything? Money, success, charm. Yet somehow, you couldn't wait for the conversation to end? That isn't a coincidence. It's because the heart judges differently than the eyes. Many years ago, a young businessman came to visit me. He was intelligent, well-dressed, successful beyond his years. But he looked troubled. He sat across from me and sighed. "Eleanor," he said, "I don't understand. I work hard. I'm polite. I try to do everything right. But people never seem to open up to me," I smiled. Not because I knew the answer immediately, but because I'd heard that question many times before. So I asked him something unexpected. "When you meet someone, what are you thinking about?" He looked puzzled, then answered honestly, "I hope they like me." I nodded gently. Then I asked another question. "And how much time do you spend wondering whether they feel comfortable?" He fell silent for almost a minute. He said nothing. Finally, he whispered, "I've never thought about that." There it was, the answer. You see, most people walk into conversations asking themselves, will this person like me? Very few ask, how can I help this person feel appreciated? That tiny shift changes everything, because the moment your attention moves away from yourself, you begin noticing others. You notice the nervous smile, the tired eyes, the hesitant voice, the quiet person standing alone while everyone else is talking. You become present, and people can always feel when someone is truly present. Presence is becoming one of the rarest gifts in the modern world. Everyone seems distracted. Phones vibrate. Notifications appear. Conversations compete with screens. People hear each other, but they rarely listen. And when someone finally does listen, it feels extraordinary. I remember meeting a little boy named Daniel. He couldn't have been older than 10. His mother brought him to a community event where I was volunteering. While the adults talked among themselves, Daniel stood quietly in the corner. Nobody meant to ignore him. They were simply busy, so I walked over, knelt beside him, smiled, and said, "I'm really glad you're here today, Daniel." His entire face lit up. For the next 20 minutes, he told me about dinosaurs, space, his favorite books, the treehouse he wanted to build, his dreams of becoming an engineer. When his mother came to collect him, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. She quietly said, "He's very shy. He almost never talks to strangers." I smiled. Children bloom where they feel safe. Adults do too. We simply become better at hiding it. As we grow older, we build invisible walls around ourselves, walls made from disappointment, heartbreak, embarrassment, failure, rejection. Every painful experience adds another brick. Eventually, we convince ourselves that protecting our hearts is safer than opening them, but kindness has a remarkable way of removing those bricks, not all at once, one at a time. A sincere smile, a patient ear, 5 thoughtful words. Each one gently reminds another person, you don't have to be afraid here. And isn't that what we're all searching for? A place where we can simply be ourselves, without pretending, without performing, without constantly proving our worth. One afternoon, I sat on a park bench feeding birds. An elderly gentleman sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he sighed deeply. "I lost my wife 6 months ago." There was no conversation leading to that confession. No questions, no explanation, just honesty. After listening quietly, I placed my hand gently on his shoulder and said, "I'm really glad you sat beside me today." He smiled through tears. Then he said something I've carried in my heart ever since. Sometimes people don't need advice. They just need to know someone is glad they exist. I've never forgotten those words because they're true. We often think helping people requires solving their problems. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is simply our presence and our appreciation. Modern life encourages us to speak quickly, respond immediately, move on to the next thing. But wisdom has taught me something different. Slow down. Notice people. Really notice them. The waitress balancing too many plates, the delivery driver working in the rain, the security guard who stands all day without anyone saying thank you, the cleaner who quietly makes every room beautiful before anyone arrives. Every one of those people has a story. Every one of them has worries, dreams, families, memories, and every one of them hopes, whether they admit it or not, to feel appreciated. I've discovered something else over the years. Kindness has a way of returning, not because the world owes us anything, but because kindness changes people. A smile creates another smile. Patience inspires patience. Appreciation encourages appreciation. It spreads quietly, like sunlight through an open window. And before long, entire families begin speaking differently. Friendships become stronger. Workplaces become warmer. Communities become kinder. All because one person decided to treat others as though they truly mattered. Imagine if every morning, instead of rushing through another ordinary greeting, you intentionally made one person feel genuinely welcome. Just one. Not 10. Not 100. One. Imagine doing that every single day. Over the course of a year, you would have brightened the lives of hundreds of people. Some of them might never tell you. Some may forget your name, but they'll remember how they felt in your presence. And that memory can quietly stay with them for years. But there is one final lesson I must share before this story is complete, because even the kindest words in the world can lose their power if one important ingredient is missing. And that ingredient is something no one can fake. Let's talk about that next. If you've listened this far, I want to tell you something very important. The 5 words themselves are not the secret. Yes. I'm glad you're here today. They are beautiful words, powerful words, but without one thing, they become ordinary. That one thing is sincerity. I've lived long enough to learn that people may not always recognize a lie with their minds, but somehow their hearts almost always do. Have you ever had someone compliment you, yet something about it didn't feel right? They smiled, they said all the right things, but somehow you knew they didn't mean it. Words have power, but intention has even more. When your words come from a genuine heart, people feel safe. When your words are spoken only to impress, people become cautious. Years ago, I met a young salesman. He had attended every seminar he could find. He had memorized conversation techniques. He knew exactly when to smile, exactly when to nod, exactly what compliments to give. On paper, he was perfect. Yet he couldn't understand why people rarely trusted him. One afternoon he asked me, "Eleanor, what's missing?" I looked at him and asked, "When someone is speaking, are you listening, or are you waiting for your turn to speak?" He laughed. Then he stopped laughing because he realized he already knew the answer. Most people don't truly listen. They're simply preparing their next sentence. They're thinking about what they'll say next, how they'll sound, whether they'll appear interesting. Meanwhile, the other person feels unheard. Re-listening is one of the rarest forms of kindness. When someone feels heard, they naturally begin to trust you, not because you've convinced them, but because you've respected them. I learned this lesson from my own father. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't famous. He never stood on grand stages giving speeches, but people loved him. Whenever someone spoke to him, they had his complete attention. If a child told him a story, he listened as though it were the most important story in the world. If a neighbor shared a problem, he never interrupted. He never rushed. He simply listened. One evening I asked him, "Papa, why do so many people come to you for advice?" He smiled and replied, "My dear, most people don't come looking for answers. They come looking for someone who cares enough to listen." I have never forgotten those words. The older I became, the more I realized how true they were. Listening isn't waiting. Listening is caring, and caring cannot be faked. Have you noticed how children always know who genuinely likes them? You can't fool a child for very long. They'll happily run towards someone whose kindness is real and quietly avoid someone whose smile is only pretending. Adults aren't very different. We've simply learned to ignore our instincts, but deep inside, we still recognize authenticity. That's why sincerity matters more than perfect words. You don't need a beautiful voice. You don't need impressive stories. You don't need endless confidence. You simply need a heart that values people. Many years ago, I boarded a crowded train. There was only one empty seat. It was beside an elderly woman who looked worried. Everyone avoided sitting next to her. Perhaps they assumed she wanted to be left alone. I smiled gently, sat beside her, and said, "I'm glad I'm sitting next to you today." She looked surprised. Then she smiled. Before that journey ended, she had told me about her grandchildren, her late husband, the little garden she loved, and the fear she felt about growing older alone. As we reached my stop, she squeezed my hand, then quietly said, "Thank you for seeing me." Not, "Thank you for talking to me." Not, "Thank you for cheering me up." She said, "Thank you for seeing me." There is a difference. Every person wants to feel seen, not judged, not measured, not compared. Seen, accepted, valued. That is why these 5 words work. Not because they're clever, but because they're honest. Another lesson life has taught me is that kindness doesn't have to be expensive. Some people believe changing someone's life requires great sacrifice. I don't. Sometimes it begins with holding a door, remembering someone's name, writing a thoughtful note, offering your full attention, or simply saying, "I'm glad you're here today." Never underestimate the small things. The biggest oak tree once began as a tiny seed. The strongest friendship often begins with a simple conversation. The greatest love stories usually begin with one sincere moment. Life is built one small kindness at a time. There is another mistake many people make. They believe kindness makes them weak. Oh, how mistaken they are. In all my years, I've discovered that kindness requires far more courage than anger. Anyone can criticize. Anyone can complain. Anyone can point out faults. But it takes strength to make another person feel valued. It takes courage to remain gentle in a world that often rewards harshness. Never confuse kindness with weakness. The strongest people I've ever met were also the gentlest because they had nothing to prove. They understood something many never learn. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. Love cannot be forced. It must be inspired. Trust cannot be purchased. It must be built. And all 3 begin with how you make people feel. Perhaps that's why I no longer worry about whether people like me. Instead, I ask myself a different question. Did I leave that person feeling a little lighter than before we met? Did they smile? Did they feel appreciated? Did they walk away believing, even for just a moment, that their life mattered? If the answer is yes, then it was a good conversation, not because I spoke well, but because someone felt seen. And after 102 years, I've learned there is no greater achievement than that. Still, there is one final lesson I want to leave with you. One lesson that has guided me through every season of life. It isn't about conversation. It isn't about attraction. It isn't even about words. It's about the kind of person you choose to become. Because in the end, people may forget everything you ever said, but they'll never forget the feeling you left behind. And that feeling becomes your true legacy. When you've lived as long as I have, you begin to notice something curious. The people who leave the deepest mark on our lives are rarely the loudest. They're rarely the richest. And they're almost never the ones who spend all their time trying to impress everyone. Instead, they're the ones who make us feel at peace. Have you ever thought about that? Think back to your childhood. Close your eyes for just a moment and remember someone who made you feel safe. Perhaps it was your grandmother, a favorite teacher, a kind neighbor, or maybe someone whose name you've almost forgotten. Can you remember exactly what they said? Probably not. But I imagine you remember how they made you feel. That's because memories fade, but emotions remain. I've often said that every conversation leaves behind a fingerprint. Sometimes it's invisible. Sometimes it lasts only a few minutes. But every now and then, someone says something so kind, so sincere, that it stays with us forever. I remember a cold winter afternoon many years ago. Snow had covered nearly every street. The wind was biting. People hurried past one another without making eye contact. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to be. As I waited at a small train station, I noticed a young mother struggling with 2 heavy bags while holding the hand of a little girl. The child looked exhausted. Her tiny face was red from the cold. Most people walked past them, not because they were cruel, simply because they were busy. I walked over, picked up one of the bags, and smiled. I'm glad our paths crossed today. The young mother looked surprised. She smiled with tired eyes. During the short walk to her train, she told me she'd recently moved to the city. She didn't know anyone. Her husband worked long hours. She often felt invisible. Before leaving, she hugged me, then whispered something I'll always treasure. You have no idea how much I needed someone to notice me today. Notice, that word stayed with me, because that's what so many people are longing for. Not praise, not applause, not admiration. Simply to be noticed, to know they exist in someone else's heart, even for a moment. You see, the world teaches us to compete, to compare, to chase success, to collect things, to become more. But very few people teach us how to make others feel more. And I believe that is one of life's greatest tragedies. I've met people with enormous houses who felt completely alone. I've met people with very little money who were surrounded by love. The difference wasn't what they owned. It was what they gave away freely. Kindness, attention, presence, encouragement. These are treasures that never become less by sharing them. In fact, the more you give, the richer your life becomes. A young woman once visited me after one of my talks. She asked, "Eleanor, how do I become more interesting?" I smiled, then answered with a question. "Why do you want to become interesting?" She thought for a moment. "So people will enjoy being around me." I gently shook my head. "My dear, don't try to become interesting. Become interested." She looked confused, so I explained. When you become genuinely interested in other people, their dreams, their fears, their stories, their joys, something remarkable happens. They begin enjoying your company naturally, not because you entertained them, but because you made them feel important. Most conversations fail for one simple reason. Everyone wants to speak. Very few want to understand. The greatest conversationalists I've ever known didn't have the best stories. They asked the best questions, questions that invited people to open their hearts, questions that couldn't be answered with a simple yes or no. Questions like, what made you smile this week? What are you most excited about these days? What dream have you never told anyone? Those questions say something beautiful. They say, I care about your world. And when someone feels that, trust begins to grow. One afternoon, my grandson asked me something that made me laugh. He said, Grandma, how do you make friends everywhere you go? I looked at him and smiled. I don't try to make friends. I try to make people feel comfortable. He frowned. I don't understand. So I took him to a nearby park. We sat quietly for a while. Eventually, a little boy wandered over. He looked curious. I smiled warmly, moved my handbag so there was room beside me, and simply said, I'm glad you're here. The little boy smiled. Within minutes, he was telling us about his favorite football team, his dog, his birthday, his dreams of becoming a pilot. As we walked home, my grandson finally understood. People open their hearts when they feel welcomed, not judged, not examined, not tested. Welcomed. The older I become, the more convinced I am that every person carries an invisible sign around their neck. It isn't written with ink. You can't see it with your eyes. But if you pay attention, you'll notice it's there. That invisible sign says, please make me feel like I matter. The happiest people I've ever met are the ones who read that sign without anyone saying a word. Perhaps that's why I no longer worry about saying the perfect thing. Instead, I try to say the sincere thing. Sometimes it's, I'm proud of you. Sometimes it's, thank you. Sometimes it's, I've missed you. And sometimes it's simply, I'm glad you're here today. 5 ordinary words capable of creating extraordinary moments. Because at the end of every day, people won't remember how clever you sounded. They won't remember the expensive clothes you wore. They won't remember the car you drove. But they'll remember the feeling they carried home after spending time with you. And if that feeling is peace, you've given them something more valuable than you may ever realize. There's one final truth I've learned after more than a century of living. It's a lesson I wish every young person could hear before life teaches it the hard way. And it has everything to do with the legacy we leave behind. Because in the end, our greatest success will never be measured by what we accumulated. It will be measured by the hearts we touched. Let me leave you with that thought in the next chapter.